Welcome to Travels Through Time, the podcast made in partnership with Unseen Histories. Hello, I'm Artemis Irvin, and today we're visiting France at the end of the Second World War and meeting one astonishingly brave female resistance fighter with a glamorous family connection. If you know anything about fragrances, you'll probably know that Miss Dior is one of the most iconic perfumes of the 20th century. And it made its debut in 1947 when its creator, Christian Dior, launched his acclaimed New Look collection. The new look was characterised by enormous fairy tale-like skirts and hyper-feminine silhouettes with tiny waists, and it was all very different to the meagre use of fabric that was used in a time of rationing and the uniforms that lots of women had worn during the war. But amongst all of the glamour and the luxury of Miss Dior's launch was one reserved but extraordinarily brave woman, Catherine Dior, Christian's younger sister and the inspiration behind the fragrance. Barely 18 months previously, Catherine had been liberated from Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she had been sent as a result of her involvement in the French resistance. Her story, and the stories of so many other women like her, is the subject of our guest today, Justine Picardie's latest book, Miss Dior, A Story of Courage and Couture. Justine is a novelist, fashion writer and biographer. She's a former editor-in-chief of Harper's Bazaar and Town and Country. Her 2010 biography of Coco Chanel was shortlisted for the Galaxy National Book Awards. I spoke to Justine about the remarkable Catherine Dior just last week. Justine, thank you so much for joining us today on Travels Through Time. It's such a pleasure to have you, especially when I know you've been so busy promoting your wonderful new book.
Thank you, Artemis. I'm thrilled to be having this conversation with you today.
So I wanted to start by asking you about the book. About Miss Dior, the book. You write very vividly about how her story came to you. And I was wondering if you could tell our listeners about that experience and when you first decided that you wanted to write this book.
I was at Christian Dior's home in the south of France, and I was sitting there with one of the archivists from Dior, and he mentioned to me Christian's younger sister, Catherine, who had been in the French resistance and who had grown roses after the war and had lived very, very close to Christian's home in Provence. And indeed, Christian and Catherine had lived there together during the war. And just immediately I thought, oh my God, nobody's ever thought about Christian Dior through the lens, the prism of his younger sister, who was clearly very brave to have been in the French resistance, but had been totally forgotten. And I was interested in their relationship as siblings, but also because Catherine was the woman to whom he was closest in the world. For a man who becomes famous with his post-war vision of heightened femininity and escapism and, the dream of romance and beauty, the fact that his sister hadn't been written about and had been forgotten by history, her story had literally been forgotten, that is when I knew I wanted to explore her story in the context of history.
Exactly, and there isn't very much evidence that remains about Catherine's life. You've had to piece together lots of different things to build this picture of who she was, and a lot of the time in the book you're writing about women who were Catherine's contemporaries, either her contemporaries in the resistance or in Ravensbrück later. And it gives this amazing sense of the book being a kind of account of French women's experiences during the war. And how important was that to you when you were researching the book to make this as much a story about these women as it was about couture and about Catherine?
Yes, that was very important to me. I've, thought long and hard, over the course of a long career about how very often the female gaze, as it's known in art, has been excluded. I mean, having been the editor-in-chief of Harper's Bazaar, I was aware at how often women have been, to a degree, objectified by male photographers or male artists. And during my time at Harper's Bazaar, I was always very keen to show women as they saw themselves and each other. And I was really struck by how women in the French Resistance had really been forgotten. There were very few people in the French Resistance to start with. When Catherine joined at the beginning of 1942, there were no more than 100,000 active members of the French Resistance, and that was in a population of 40 million. Even at the height of the resistance, which is after the D-Day landings in June 1944, there were, maximum 400,000. So 1% of the population. The network that Catherine was part of, which was called F2, it was about 2,800 members of it. It was one of the earliest networks in the French Resistance, and about 25% of them were women. But what really struck me is that women like Catherine, who were in the resistance and then deported to Ravensbrück concentration camp and other camps, their stories were really ignored when they returned to France, or at least when the survivors amongst them returned to France. And as I began to piece together Catherine's story, I began to realize that what I wanted to write was a book which is called, Miss Dior, A Story of Courage and Couture. And for me, Miss Dior is not one woman. Miss Dior was named by Christian, it's the name of his first perfume, as a tribute to Catherine. But Miss Dior for me is the story of many women, including Catherine. Miss Dior is also an imaginary woman, this symbol of French luxury and couture and perfume after the Second World War. But she, if Miss Dior, is the name both of a book and a perfume and indeed a very famous couture dress, in my book, she is also the voices of many silenced women.
Yeah, it's such a powerful thought. Why do you think it was that their stories were and their experiences were ignored or silenced after the war?
I think that France had a particularly tricky history of occupation and collaboration. So, as in many of parts of Europe, there had to be a kind of collective amnesia in order to move forward after the war. So when Charles de Gaulle, at the liberation of Paris in August 1944, in his famous speech at the liberation, he says, France has liberated itself, the eternal France, the whole of France. And so although there were post-war trials and there was, the savage operation, or as it's called, there is also quite rapidly a forgetting. And I think that this particularly applied to the women who were the survivors of the camps, because I think it was very hard for the French to see them because they were these living reminders of the evil that had been done in France. When Catherine and other members of the resistance were arrested in July 1944, Catherine was arrested by a unit of the Gestapo in Paris called the Rue de la Pompe Gestapo, and it had a German leader, and it worked with German members of the Gestapo in Paris, but the majority of the people in this unit were French, and Catherine and 300 other members of the resistance were tortured by this Gestapo unit, and they were tortured by French collaborators. They had been betrayed by French collaborators too. So collaboration was so widespread, not all of it so active as in the form of this Gestapo unit, but a kind of, I suppose, just doing what it takes to survive. Given how rare relatively speaking, it was to resist, that leaves massive divisions between those who'd collaborated, those who'd resisted, and those who had betrayed members of the resistance. And that means to see those returning women who returned in the early summer of 1945, like Catherine from the camps, with their heads had been shaved, they were emaciated, they were unrecognizable, they were literally bearing both the physical and psychological scars and wounds of their suffering. People just did not want to hear their stories.
Mm. It was too raw and too
painful and too shaming,
too
humiliating. And Christian himself in his memoir says that at the time of the launch of his couture house, which he conceives of really relatively soon after the traumatic ending of the Second World War, he says Paris is still bearing its wounds in the form of bullet holes in the walls of Paris. But I think that people were still bearing its scars. And there's a picture that I included in the book about les femmes tendues, as they were known, so the women who had their heads shaved after the liberation, and their heads were shaved to humiliate them for sleeping with the enemy, sleeping with Germans. But I think in some cases, those women whose heads were shaved were scapegoated. I mean, there were just as many men who collaborated. Their heads weren't shaved. And I think that women became scapegoats. But then what was very traumatic for the women like Catherine, who returned from the camps and their heads had been shaved in the camps and often their hair hadn't grown back because they were starving, that there is a woman whose testimony I use in the book, that she said they were mistaken for collaborators whose heads had been shaved. So the trauma of that female experience is so profound.
Thinking about how those women, as you described, were kind of physical reminders for people of the horrors of what had happened. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is in the book you very regularly visit the places that you're writing about. How important was it for you to be in those places physically?
As a writer, it's always been important for me to actually go to the places I'm writing about. I think the place can be a character in a book. It certainly always is for me, the spirit of a place. And I think that for me as a writer, there are very powerful places or resonant places where the kind of veil between the past and the present, between the living and the dead, can become more translucent. And I'm always interested in physically exploring those places as well as exploring them as a writer.
Mm-hmm. So that leads us on really nicely to the question that we ask all of our guests on the podcast, which is that if you could travel through time to any year in history, what year would you choose?
For me, the year would be 1947. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, it's the year where, although Christian Dior has already set up his couture house the previous year, it's the year that he does his first, what is seen as revolutionary new look collection, which takes place in February 1947 in Paris. But it's also when those post-war war crimes trials are still going on in Germany in the aftermath of the Second World War. And for me, the conjunction of those, both the trial and the presentation of Christian Dior's first collection, are happening simultaneously. And that to me is really resonant.
Yeah, exactly, because it really struck me in the book that a lot of the questions that you seem to be posing is it ever possible to move on from something as traumatic as what you've been describing, whether it's through art and fashion or and kind of something joyful, or through kind of not retribution is the wrong word, but the kind of legal aspect, the justice aspect, the paying for the crimes committed, that those two things felt quite thematically similar. It's about how do you, in the wake of this horrific thing that's happened, how do you move on from it?
What I was really struck by, partly because they take place at the same, almost exactly the same time, the Ravensbrück trial and Christiane Dior's show, the last day of the Ravensbrück trial, which was the first, time and place I chose, which takes place on the 3rd and 4th of February 1947, and just a week later you have the Christiane Dior trial, and it is in a sense a catwalk show, a couture show. There are people that sit and judge it, which are, members of the press, consumers. It is judged to be a success or a failure. And then at the same time, you have what are sometimes known as the show trials that happened after the Second World War. And they have to be show trials because justice has to be seen to be done, because the crimes of the Nazis were so horrific, but very, very few people are put on trial. So there is an element of show about it.
So without further ado, would you like to tell us about the first scene that you want to visit in 1947?
Yes, so it's in Hamburg, in the court in Hamburg, and it was largely a British trial, because Hamburg, it was the British that were running the proceedings, because Hamburg was in the British zone, and it's where the first Ravensbrück trial takes place. The Nuremberg trial had already started, and the Nuremberg trial, as we know, was the one that really got all the headlines. The other trials that take place in the aftermath of the Second World War receive much less publicity and coverage. And in the book, I describe really what takes place in this trial. And what's interesting about it is that there are female defendants as well as men, because Ravensbrück was Hitler's only concentration camp for women, and about 3,500 female concentration camp guards that then went to work in camps throughout the Third Reich, but were all trained at Ravensbrück. So the trial judges women as well as men, and there is a kind of taboo in thinking about the crimes of women during the Holocaust. And there were female guards, there were also female doctors and nurses that took part in the really horrific medical experiments that were carried out at Ravensbrück. So the trial began in early December 1946. And again, the timing is so interesting to me, because that is when Christiane Dior is beginning the process of designing what will be his first fashion collection. And his first fashion collection is looking at the idea of femininity in the aftermath of the Second World War. But on trial, you have women who are really, portrayed as monsters, because instead of behaving in a way that is seen as being traditionally female, which is nurturing and caring, they are as cruel as the male SS. They're certainly not as senior as the men. They occupy much more junior roles and right at the bottom of the SS hierarchy, but they are nevertheless put on trial. And what is striking about them is that there's something so, yes, they're monsters, but there is something so ordinary about all of them. And one of the observers at the trial was a member of the French resistance called Germaine Tillion, and she kept a secret diary when she was at Ravensbrück, and her writing was very important to me. She's an important character in Miss Dior, but her testimony is very important. So she was an anthropologist by training. So I think almost as a survival mechanism, she documented what she saw and experienced at Ravensbrück as a prisoner, and then she goes and documents this trial. And she looks at it in a very clear-sighted, almost, academic, anthropological way in terms of writing everything down. But of course, as a woman, as a prisoner who has suffered these terrible experiences, she's also writing in a very emotional way. And I was wondering actually if I might read some of her testimony in her description. She's not called as a witness, but she is a witness to history. So one of the women on trial was called Dorothea Binns. She was still only 26 at the time of her trial, which shows she joined Ravensbrück at the age to work there as a 19-year-old guard. And she became feared throughout the camp for her brutality. She's blonde. Her hair was very, very neatly styled at the trial, just as it had been during her time as a guard. And her former colleagues who were on trial in the SS all look similarly respectable. And Germaine writes, there they were, well-dressed, well-groomed, well-scrubbed, proper. A dentist, doctors, a former printer, nurses, middle-level workers, no criminal records, normal educations, normal childhoods, ordinary people. And Germaine attended every day of the trial, which goes on until the 3rd of February 1947. And all of the 16 defendants pleaded not guilty to the charges of ill treatment and killing Allied prisoners interned at Ravensbrück. So it's interesting, they plead not guilty. All were found guilty, although one of them, a doctor involved in the medical experiments, died of a heart attack just 2 days before sentencing. And then Germaine goes on to write, during the recesses, with the courtroom almost empty, I remained there, facing them, facing the defendants, looking at them silently, overwhelmed with pain and sorrow before these creatures who had committed so much evil and who now, aligned only a few yards from me, were having to answer for the thousands of cold, deliberate murders of defenseless women. And this experience reinforced her sense that the sheer scale of the suffering at Ravensbrück was so unfathomable, so enormous, so immense, that it would be impossible to ensure justice for the victims or to explain why these apparently ordinary people, these perpetrators, had behaved with such savage inhumanity. So she writes, I was very aware that what I knew personally barely scratched the surface of their crimes, and that no man, no legal proceedings, nor any historical study could ever give the complete account. And they, the best informed, the only ones who had known the entire story, had already forgotten part of it. I became all too aware of the widening gap between what really happened and that imprecise representation known as history. It's so powerful what she writes, because the defendants plead not guilty and are unable to accept their guilt, because it's so unimaginable what happened in Ravensbrück and other camps, that this enormous chasm opens up between those who have experienced it, those who have perpetrated it, and those who cannot understand it. And this seems to me to be very relevant to Catherine Dior's experience and the experience of others like her, that these women, I mean, there were over, many women of many different nationalities were imprisoned at Ravensbrück. There were Polish women, British women, French women, Dutch women, German women, and they return to their homeland, but to a place where nobody can comprehend what they've experienced. And that is and becomes another part of their suffering after the war.
Yeah, thank you so much for reading those extracts. They're so, like you say, they're incredibly powerful. I wonder, what are we to make of these female guards at Ravensbrück, or the other, apparently ordinary people who committed these crimes? What do you make of them when you were researching for this book?
Well, I went to Ravensbrück twice while I was researching the book, and I really didn't want to go. I felt kind of scared of going to confront, such a terrible place. And I'm half Jewish. My father is Jewish, and his parents, my grandparents, sort of like, as was in common with that generation, never talked about the Second World War, but they had extended family members who died in the camps and during the Holocaust. So I didn't want to go there, but ultimately I realized I couldn't write the book without going there. So when I went to Ravensbrück, I went to Berlin first, and Ravensbrück's about 80 miles north of Berlin. Very, very few people go to Ravensbrück. It's not one of the camps that is a site of pilgrimage, like Auschwitz, for example. So when I went, I met the archivists there, but there was nobody visiting the camp. I sort of had it all to myself. It's a massive site. And that's why I had to go back a few months later. But I was struck by so many different things, but one of them was the camp commandant's house, which has been preserved because after the war, it was part of the occupied Soviet zone. It was part of East Germany. And the Soviets that occupied the camp and were there for quite a long time didn't really do anything. So somebody, presumably rather senior, was based in the camp commandant's house. The camp, had been two commandants, and the one that was there for the longest period and was there when Catherine was there was a family man called Fritz Suren. And he had lived in this house, which is right next to the camp. And it's up on a hill, so you would have been able to see into the camp, with his wife and 4 children. And the house looks like something, it's like a sort of almost like a gingerbread house in a Brothers Grimm fairy tale. It's built according to the SS principles. Himmler, who conceived of Ravensbrück and ran the camps, had a house nearby where he kept the woman who was his lover, the wife of, not his wife, but the mother of 2 children. So the fact was that this sort of idealized vision of the Nazi family is very close to the camp, both in the form of the commandant's house, but also Himmler's mistress and 2 children. So there's this strange conjunction between a place of unimaginable suffering where women are held and this sort of idealized vision of the Nazi family. And that was something I wanted to explore. And the house, the commandant's house, is a house for a good Nazi family. And I did a lot of reading about Himmler and about Himmler's view of the SS and the role played in it of wives and children. And they became themselves honorary members of the SS. And they, Himmler really believed in what he was doing. And so too did members of the SS. So it wasn't that you can say, I'm sure in some cases, they were brutal. In many cases, they were brutal psychopaths who enjoyed what they were doing. But in some cases, as in Himmler's case, he truly believed in what he was doing. So he was an ideologue. And in all his speeches about the camps, about extermination through labor, which was what was the system used at Ravensbrück, where people were literally worked to death. He uses this word decency over and over again. So Himmler and the people that reported into Himmler truly believed what they were doing. And that, for me, kind of came through in Ravensbrück. There is this terrible, in their mind, that's why ordinary people did it, because they believed in what they were doing.
And just before we move on to your second scene that you'd like to visit, you mentioned before that you've described these kind of trials as show trials. And is that the case in this one, that where the trial of the guards at Ravensbrück, would you describe it as a show trial?
Yes, I mean, Fritz Sören, the camp commandant who'd lived there, he actually escaped British custody just a few days before the trial started, so he wasn't on trial. And yes, there's a few senior people there, but quite others not so senior. And I think all the trials are, to a degree, I mean, obviously the first Nuremberg trial is more than a show trial because very, very senior people are on trial. But Hitler's killed himself, Himmler's killed himself, Bormann has disappeared, Eichmann has disappeared. So not all of the architects are there, but there were 8 million members of the Nazi Party in Germany. There were 1,100 concentration camps that employed hundreds of thousands of people. And then there were all the German industrialists who used slave labor. There was a Siemens factory at Ravensbrück. There was one of the slave labor camps that Catherine Dior worked at was a BMW factory that was manufacturing, fighter aircraft engines. And I think the Allies eventually took the view they couldn't send 8 million Germans to prison. So this process of denazification takes place. And by this point, really by 1947, they're already more worried about the rise of the Soviet Union than they are about the Nazis. So there's a different form of collective amnesia that begins to take place, just as it has done in France, where, people that were very good Nazis and good industrialists have to be, either they're never put on trial or they're released from prison early because they need to take part in what becomes known as the great economic miracle of post-war Western Europe. And that takes those industrialists and other leading members of the Nazi Party.
So would you like to tell us about what the second scene that you want to visit in 1947 is?
So the second scene takes place just a few days later in Paris, and it is the opening of Christian Dior's couture house at 30 Avenue Montaigne. And it's been a really, really harsh winter in right across Europe, actually. And France and Paris is still in the grip of rationing. There are still shortages of everything: food, petrol, fuel. But nevertheless, he has taken this extraordinary decision to set up a couture house of his own. He was already, he'd been working for another couturier, Lucien Lelong, but it's only with his sister's return in 1945 that this ambition seems to awaken within him to set up his own couture house and to launch his first perfume. So people gather outside 30 Avenue Montaigne, and you've got the kind of the fashion elite. So Carmel Snow is there, who was the then editor-in-chief of Harper's Bazaar, Bettina Ballard, who was the fashion editor from American Vogue. You also have the editors from Vogue Paris. And also sitting there very quietly is Catherine Dior, his younger sister, who has returned from the camps really not very long previously, less than 18 months before. And people walk into the couture house, they go up the spiral staircase and the circular staircase and into the salon where the show will take place. But there's so many of them, they're sort of all sitting on the stairs, and what seems so extraordinary to everybody that's gathered there is the luxury. So the house is filled, the couture house, the maison as it's called, is filled with beautiful bouquets of flowers. And Catherine, by this point, has set up, she was awarded a license to run a cut flower business in Paris. And she's a dealer in cut flowers at the Paris flower market. So she will have filled her brother's maison with flowers. And it is also filled with the scent of Miss Dior. And a litre of this perfume has been sprayed throughout the salon. So it smells delicious. And then the models, the show starts and the models start walking through the salon, and they are moving very, very fast. And they are wearing just incredibly beautiful clothes that are long, are romantic, and they are the antithesis of what women were wearing during the war, when many women were in uniform, and the women who weren't in uniform during the war are wearing ration clothes. So skirts are relatively short and tight because there's not enough fabric to do long full skirts. So there's all this fabric is being used. And in one sense, although it's christened the new look by Carmel Snow, the then editor-in-chief of Harper's Bazaar, in some ways it looks back in time to La Belle Époque, the golden age before the First World War, where women wear, beautiful romantic long skirts. What's interesting is that Christian himself calls the collection La Corolle, and the corolla is part of a flower. So it's literally, he says it's a collection for flower women. And there is his sister, Catherine, sitting there quietly. And she is the flower woman who has survived Ravensbrück, returned from the dead, returned miraculously, is both selling flowers in Paris, but she's also growing flowers in Provence at their father's farm where they had lived together for part of the Second World War. The farm is in the midst of the rose growing region in Provence, and Christian and Catherine shared a love of gardening, shared a love of growing roses. They'd grown vegetables together there during the occupation, but they were also both supremely superb gardeners who were very good at growing roses. So there is the real flower woman, and nobody picks up on her story. Nobody talks about Catherine. Nobody talks about the war. And yet in the front row, there are people that were directly affected by it. So there were people that worked for Vogue Paris. The editor, Michel de Bruynhoff, and the fashion director, fashion editor, Solange Diane, had both lost their sons. Michel de Bruynhoff's son had been shot by the Gestapo just before the liberation. Solange had lost her son. He was also killed. Her husband had been imprisoned and then deported to Bergen-Belsen, where he died. And there were two other friends of Christian Dior who were very sort of senior figures in the world of French fashion magazines. And their daughter had been imprisoned in Ravensbrück, but had also in Auschwitz, and had given evidence at the Nuremberg trial about the conditions at Auschwitz. So what's so strange to me thinking about it now is you've got these people who are brought together by this beautiful couture show, and yet the threads that also join them are their experiences of the Second World War and the resistance and the concentration camps, and yet that doesn't become part of the legends of Christian Dior. It's utterly excluded. And I found that intriguing, perplexing, and extraordinary.
And this seems like such a basic question, but I was wondering it while you were describing that amazing. You really painted the picture so beautifully, and the smell and the colours and everything. How was he able to get a hold of all of this material and all of these luxury items in a time of rationing?
First of all, he had his financial backing came from an industrialist, a textile industrialist called Marcel Boussac, whose money had been made in textiles. So that's number one. And number two, Paris couture and perfume represents, just as de Gaulle becomes famous for this phrase, a certain idea of France, France, the eternal France. Couture and perfume was very important to the French idea of itself, and emerging from the trauma of the Second World War. And so materials were made available to Dior, as it were, free of rationing, because for economic reasons, France needed to start exporting again because it was broke, it was bankrupt. So if a couture dress is sold to, a rich American client or a British client or whoever, that brought in much needed foreign currency. It was worth many, many tons of coal and of fuel. But it's also very important to France's symbolically. And what's interesting is that I was struck how these Dior couture shows took place in Germany quite soon after the end of the Second World War, but they take place at the invitation of French diplomatic initiatives, because it's very important to France to show that this idea of Frenchness is still very strong. And Dior is the embodiment of this. And the Dior woman, Miss Dior, who, as I said, is a partly imaginary woman, but she becomes the embodiment of this very graceful vision of La Belle France.
And what was people's reaction to the show? How did they? Because you can imagine that maybe there might have been some resentment of such a display of opulence and luxury.
Well, at the show itself, it's people are giving it a standing ovation, and Christian Dior literally becomes famous overnight. People. So even if people couldn't afford a Dior couture gown, women around the world responded by wanting to change the shape of what they were wearing. So rather than the very boxy jackets or the sort of military looking skirts, they want these romantic full skirts. But what's interesting, and I'm not sure if it was a sort of publicity stunt or not, but later that year, a fashion shoot was taking place at a French street market, because the photographer thought it would be a sort of picturesque vision of Paris. And a photographer caught these enraged looking women at the street market attacking the model wearing Dior couture, because they were so outraged by this excess to them at a time when they're still rationing. And Nancy Mitford, the writer who loved Dior couture and was able to afford it because The Pursuit of Love, her novel, had been such a success, and she was living in Paris at the time, wrote letters describing this incident, this scene, and saying, to friends and relatives, so, one risks one's life going out in Dior couture because it seems to enrage class loathing in a way that nothing else can do, because, of course, people knew Dior's prices and luxury.
You have this beautiful phrase at the end of your chapter about this particular moment, where you write that how could anyone imagine an enchanting dream after a time of such madness and horror? And it kind of struck me that that's like depending on your interpretation, you could either, how could anyone imagine, almost like it was an affront, but also how could anyone imagine, thank God someone did, because we all really needed that.
Yes, and I think that although I had moments writing the book where thinking, well, how could he imagine this? But I feel that, I mean, the older I get, and the more I understand about, the history of that Dior lived through, 2 world wars, the Wall Street crash, the first global flu pandemic, the Great Depression, the Second World War. But just also in my own life, I realized that moments of happiness and joy and magic should be cherished, and that unimaginable darkness, when you endure and survive that makes the light all the more precious. And one of the things that I was so struck by when I went to Ravensbrück, and I will never forget, is this rose garden at Ravensbrück. And I had to go there to discover it. I wouldn't have found it if I hadn't gone there. But it's this place of totally unexpected beauty. So after the end of the war, on the site of the mass grave next to the crematorium, a number of women returned, survivors, to plant roses in memory of their dead friends, their dead sisters, mothers, daughters, their lost sisters, as it were. And a French woman who was in the French resistance, but also a rose grower, developed this rose called Resurrection that would survive the very harsh winters in this northern part of Germany. And these resurrection roses have been planted there and continue to be planted there. And when I went for the first time at the end of November, when it was really cold and the ground was still frozen overnight, these resurrection roses were in bloom. And that, to me, became so symbolic, both of the resilience of the human spirit, but also how beauty and magic is still meaningful and can also be an act of resistance. So also in the archives at Ravensbrück, I found, and I include pictures of them in the book, these really beautiful little talismans that were created as acts of resistance by the prisoners, which very often include a rose motif. So whether it's a drawing of a rose that is given in secret to a friend, or there's an extraordinary tiny carved cherry stone that it's carved in the shape of a handbag, and it's got a little heart on it, and was given again as a talisman of love and sisterliness, from one woman to another, and that they, against all the odds, were still creating beauty. I also included illustrations in the book that had been made by French women, French members of the resistance, and that they did these drawings. I didn't want to show those terrible, horrific drawings that we remember about what the camps looked like when they were liberated. I wanted the women to be able to, to give them the female gaze, allow them to show how they saw the camp, both through their own drawings, but through their own words, through their own testimony. And that felt really important to me. So there was, much to my astonishment, part of what Ravensbrück came to symbolize for me were these fleeting images or moments of the human spirit defying the Nazi regime through finding beauty and remaining women, as opposed to being. So the Nazi regime was able to proceed with extermination, whether through the gas chambers or extermination through labor, by seeing prisoners as not being human, sometimes even subhuman, less than human, just ready for extermination. And these women showed that they were still women. And I interviewed one of the last remaining survivors who'd been in the camp with Catherine and the other French women, and she was a Hungarian and Jewish, and she and her younger sister had survived, but the rest of their family had been killed at Auschwitz, and she ended up in one of these slave labor camps with Catherine. And she said that the French women including Catherine, had taught them how to do the V sign, the V for victory. Also that she knew that Catherine was still sabotaging the machinery that they were forced to work on, in a munitions factory, in an aircraft factory. And that was an act of resistance, but also that they had looked chic to her and her sister because they'd unraveled sort of threads from their ragged uniforms, or to weave into, to knit into sort of turbans that they would wrap around their shaved heads. And that I mean, I don't think the French women felt that they looked, they looked at each other and they looked to one another like they were dying. But to these two young sisters, they looked fashionable.
Mm, mm. Yeah, and there's so much strength and beauty in that image as well. I mean, yeah.
Sahava, as her name is, said to me that, Catherine was the captain of her own soul, which is such a resonant phrase that somehow, despite the entire regime's aim of dehumanization, that Catherine, one of the ways she could survive was remaining the captain of her own soul.
That's such an amazing phrase. That literally just gave me goosebumps when you said that, a captain of her own soul. She was clearly an extraordinary woman. Hello, it's Artemis. For some time, we've been working with the visual historian Jordan Lloyd, and we've been telling you about his fascinating colorization work. Well, recently, Jordan has launched his new project. It's a website called Unseen Histories, which showcases a broad range of fascinating historical material. You can read feature-length pieces there about female fashion in the Victorian era, or beautifully illustrated extracts from books like Susan Denham-Wade's A History of Seeing. For those of you who have enjoyed Jordan's colorization work in the past, there's a full range of remastered photographs from the archives of the Library of Congress. It's history for our times. Do have a look for yourself at unseenhistories.com. You're talking about the Rose Garden at Ravensbrück, and I thought that led us on really, really nicely to the final scene that you'd like to visit. Would you like to tell us where we are?
So the final scene is in Catherine's rose fields in Provence, so towards the end of May 1947. And this farmhouse, which is still there and where I went while I was writing the book, she had inherited after the death of their father, Maurice Dior, in December 1946. And as I said earlier, Christiane and Catherine had spent time during the Second World War there together, during the occupation. And they'd grown vegetables, but it's also in the heart of the rose growing area for Grasse. And Grasse is the headquarters of the French perfume industry. And Catherine went on to become a very successful rose grower, growing roses for the Grasse perfume industry as an ingredient, but for her brother, for Christian Dior, including for Miss Dior, the perfume that was named after her. And she went on to both wear Dior, the couture, but to wear Miss Dior, the perfume, every day for the rest of her life, so that this element of beauty remains with her and part of her and inspired by her. But she also, there's something so miraculous about having the strength and the belief and the hope in the future to tend her fields of roses, which she went on doing until her death at the age of 90. And I think to plant a rose field and to tend a rose field, like any garden, and she had a very beautiful garden there too, is an act of hope in the future. And I love gardening. When you're gardening, if you plant a tree or a rose meadow, you are planting for the future. You are planting for future generations. And you are also doing so in hope, because of course a bad winter or a very, late frosts, a delayed spring can affect roses like every other part of horticulture. But that belief that it's worth continuing, to me, is so inspiring. And Catherine went on believing in her roses. And I found that incredibly inspiring.
Catherine lived a really full life, didn't she? She died in not very many years ago.
Yes, she died in June 2008 at the age of 90, having brought in, what would be her final rose harvest at the end of May, early June. And she did lead a long and resilient life on her own terms. She was not unscarred by her experience. Her medical records form part of her records in the archives of the French Resistance. And she did suffer from bouts of depression, anxiety, isolation, insomnia, and she was left with the physical after effects of both her torture by the Gestapo in Paris and then her time in the camps. And yet her resilience was such that she was able to make a life for herself. And one of the people I quote in the book, who was a soldier and a survivor from a more recent war, who met her because every year in the nearest village to where she lived in Provence, she went to the annual Remembrance Day for France of soldiers and members of the resistance. And he told me that he said to her that, he'd survived a more recent war, but that he said that he knew who she was, and that, he admired her for what she'd done and fighting for freedom. And, that he sort of asked the question, how did you survive? And she said to him, aime la vie, jeune homme, aime la vie, which is love life, young man, love life. And that's so powerful. There were things she could not forgive. She was, till the end of her life, she couldn't bear to hear German voices. To even see a German car would upset her, but she loved life. She loved her roses, and she continued to believe in her values, which was freedom and democracy and this great resilience. And her brother. Her brother dies in 1957 at the age of only 52, and she preserved Christian's legacy by keeping all his drawings, his sketches, the couture gowns. And it's thanks to her that where I began, which was in the Dior archives, looking at these beautiful sketches and illustrations done by Christiane Dior. It's thanks to Catherine that these survived. So with great modesty, she never sort of boasted of her own medals, which she received from the British and the Polish authorities because of what she'd done for those intelligence networks during her time in the resistance, as well as France. So she never boasted about her own achievements, but she preserves her brother's legacy, which really, brought me back to where I started in my research, looking in the Dior archives, all of which had been preserved by Catherine.
And I did wonder if you had the chance to ask Catherine any questions or to speak to her, what would you like to speak to her about?
First of all, where did she find the courage to join the resistance at a time when so few people were doing so? What was it that gave her that courage? And how did she feel knowing how few people had taken that step? What gave her that courage and that strength?
Yeah. So before we head back into the present, you're allowed to bring back a memento with you from 1947. There's so much here to reflect on. I imagine you might find it very hard, but what memento would you like to bring back with you from 1947?
I would like just a very small bottle of the original Miss Dior, one that Christian, one of those very early ones that Christian had made as a tribute for his beloved younger sister. And I feel that within it, you have the roses that were so important to both of them, but also it's the scent of history, it's the scent of freedom, it's the scent of hope. And the scent of history would be something really miraculous to bring back with me as a memento.
Well, thank you so much, Justine. It's been, I mean, I have to admit there are several times throughout our conversation where I did literally get goosebumps from talking to you and listening to you describe this amazing woman in this frightening and extraordinary time. So thank you so much for joining us on Travels Through Time.
Thank you, Artemis. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be with you today.
That was me, Artemis Irvin, speaking to Justine Picardie about the year 1947. Her book, Miss Dior, A Story of Courage and Couture, is published by Faber and is available to buy now. This week, we've got not just one, but 2 episodes for you. As Halloween is almost upon us, Peter took the chance to talk to Malcolm Gaskill, one of Britain's leading experts in the history of witchcraft. Together, they'll be heading back to the New England frontier in the mid-17th century to analyse the curious case of Mary Parsons. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you then.